My name is Courtney Lane, and the night my mom decided Christmas was canceled, she didn't cry or beg. She went straight for the kill. Christmas is off. Expect a call from my lawyer. That was her entire voicemail. No hello, no explanation, just that cold message playing in the dark while I stood in my tiny kitchen. I didn't call back. I didn't text paragraphs. I typed one word. Understood. Then I put my phone face down on the counter, opened my laptop, and logged into the mortgage portal for the house my parents loved to call our family home. The same house I'd been quietly paying for while they told everyone they were barely hanging on. Balance, $320,000. Co-borrowers, my parents, and me. My hands weren't shaking when I clicked through the forms. Remove cosigner. Confirm identity. Review consequences. The warning popped up. This could force a full reassessment of the loan, and if the remaining borrowers didn't qualify, the bank would take appropriate action. For the first time in years, that sounded like their problem, not mine. I hit submit. 2 days later, my phone almost vibrated off the table. 67 missed calls, dozens of texts, voicemails from my mom, from my dad, from a number that introduced itself as their attorney, suddenly very eager to clear up a misunderstanding. Funny thing is, I hadn't misunderstood anything at all. Before I tell you how my entire family went to war over that one decision, take a second to subscribe and stick around. And if you've ever felt more like your family's wallet than their child, tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. A few months before everything started unraveling, I had already begun carrying a weight that didn't belong to me. It settled quietly into my routines, slipping into moments where life used to feel ordinary. I worked my steady job in downtown Tampa, drove home through weather that changed from sun to rain in minutes, and tried to believe things were normal. But there was always a pull, a sense that responsibility in my family flowed in only one direction. My mom Brenda first brought up the mortgage on a humid afternoon that felt like any other. She talked about rising costs, the pressure of maintaining a home near the coast, the way insurance kept climbing year after year. My dad Howard hovered behind her, hands tucked into his pockets, as if hoping invisibility would protect him from hard conversations. They framed everything as temporary, just until things stabilized. They made it sound like I was being included, rather than recruited. I wanted to believe them, because wanting to believe felt easier than asking uncomfortable questions. The documents arrived in my inbox that same evening. I stared at my own name listed beside theirs, realizing I now held part of a burden I hadn't created. My signature became the bridge that kept their house standing. At first, I told myself it was fine. I could manage it. They were my family, and helping them didn't feel wrong then. It felt like something a good daughter did, even if the reasoning behind it was beginning to wear thin. Expenses surfaced in waves after that. A failing air conditioner in the middle of summer, a leaking patch of roof after a passing storm, an overdue utilities notice they claimed had slipped through the cracks. My involvement shifted from occasional help to quiet expectation. My mom Brenda treated each request as if it were a natural extension of my role. My dad Howard rarely spoke up, avoiding responsibility the same way he avoided eye contact. My older brother Derek simply acted as though financial trouble had never been his business. He moved through life unbothered, insulated by years of being the one exception to every rule. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that I was the one with stable income and predictable bills. I convinced myself that supporting them was temporary, that sooner or later they would regain footing. But each time I covered something, another need surfaced. Insurance renewals always came with increases. Repairs never seemed to be enough. Unexpected charges showed up with explanations that felt thinner and thinner. I felt myself becoming part of their structure. The invisible beam holding up everything they refused to acknowledge was crumbling. The more I gave, the quieter they became about gratitude. Help stopped being help and settled into something they believed I owed them. If I hesitated, the air shifted. Brenda's voice tightened. Howard withdrew even further, and Derek's silence carried an edge I couldn't name. I wasn't expected to question anything. I was expected to comply, because compliance kept their world intact. I began noticing how my own needs were placed last. Vacations I postponed because a bill at their house was urgent. Plans I canceled because a storm had hit them harder than expected. Even my savings account felt less like a future and more like a tool they had access to. The imbalance grew slowly, almost gently, until it shaped how I moved through each week. Every decision I made became filtered through what they might need next. There was a night when I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by unopened mail from my own life, realizing I had stopped thinking about what I wanted altogether. The thought came quietly, but once it appeared, it refused to leave. I had built an existence around their crises. I had learned to measure my own value by how much I could absorb. Still, I didn't consider stepping back. Not then. I told myself families go through difficult cycles. I told myself things would ease once they adjusted to new costs. But nothing eased. Their expectations only expanded. My name on the mortgage became the unspoken reason I couldn't say no. They leaned on it, used it, shaped their choices around the assumption that I would always be there to stabilize whatever they destabilized. I carried that truth with me through the summer months, watching responsibility turn into routine, and routine turn into obligation. And somewhere inside those quiet shifts, the foundation beneath us began to fracture in ways none of them noticed. I was the only one who felt the pressure building, the only one sensing that something eventually had to give. As the weeks moved closer to the holiday season, the atmosphere around my family shifted in ways that didn't feel obvious at first. It started with small comments my mom Brenda dropped into conversations, hints wrapped in casual tone, as though she were testing how much attention I was paying. She mentioned plans that sounded loose and unfinished, little remarks about needing a break or wanting to reset before the new year. None of it seemed directed at me, yet each comment carried a strange distance, as if something had already been decided without my involvement. I didn't think much of it until whispers of a trip started weaving into their routines. They spoke about schedules tightening, work conflicts appearing, obligations stacking up. The odd part was how carefully they danced around specifics, as though the details were too fragile to say aloud in my presence. I sensed a quiet hush whenever I walked into a room, a change in rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. The silence was too deliberate to ignore, yet not sharp enough to confront. Around that time, my older brother Derek seemed unusually energized. He moved with an ease that clashed with the stress they constantly talked about. He posted vague updates online about needing a deserved break, captions layered with self-satisfaction. I recognized that tone. It was the same tone he used whenever he felt chosen, favored, lifted above responsibility. The shift in his mood felt like the final puzzle piece that made the bigger picture impossible to overlook. My mom's explanations grew thinner as the days passed. She talked about space being limited, about how certain plans were already set before she could organize things properly. None of it made sense, because none of it needed to. They weren't trying to build a story I could believe in. They were building a story where I simply didn't exist. The absence of an invitation wasn't the painful part. It was the certainty that they assumed I'd accept it without question. One evening, while sorting through my bills, I noticed a medical charge that didn't belong to me. It was small, easy to miss, buried between mundane transactions. The name of the clinic didn't matter as much as the realization that the card used was one I frequently helped pay down for the sake of emergencies. It became clear the purchase wasn't medical at all. A quick search revealed it belonged to a resort in the Florida Keys, a place known for holiday packages marketed as exclusive retreats. The cost matched a deposit for a December stay. I sat there staring at the charge, feeling a quiet heaviness settle in my chest. So this was the plan they didn't want to mention, the kind of trip that required saving, planning, and coordination. A trip that included them, but excluded me entirely. I had paid towards something designed to leave me out, and they hadn't even tried to hide the evidence well. It wasn't carelessness. It was confidence. Confidence that I would never question where my money went. The part that lingered with me wasn't the expense itself. It was the intention behind it, the silent decision that my presence wasn't valuable enough to consider. I wondered how long they had been preparing for this. How many conversations happened in rooms where my name was used lightly, as if I were more obligation than daughter. I tried to piece together past weeks, examining expressions, half-finished statements, subtle pauses. The truth didn't arrive in a single moment. It formed gradually, like condensation on glass, making everything hazy but undeniable. I found myself replaying memories that never felt strange before. The way Derek stopped asking whether I had plans for the holidays, the unusual politeness in my mom's tone when she asked about my work schedule, the sudden interest my dad Howard had in checking weather reports for the coast, despite having no reason to monitor anything beyond his daily routine. Every fragment pointed toward a plan unfolding around me, not malicious in action, but cutting in its indifference. I didn't feel anger then. What I felt was something quieter, a sense of being unanchored. It was as though I had spent years holding up pieces of their world without realizing mine had been drifting. The trip was only a symptom of something older, something rooted in how they viewed me. My value to them had become so tied to what I could provide that my absence didn't disrupt their plans. It streamlined them. As the date on the transaction confirmed their timeline, a dull clarity settled over me. They had already crafted their version of a family holiday, one that fit neatly into their narrative, a narrative where I was both essential and disposable. Essential when bills arrived, disposable when joy was being divided. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask why. The question no longer mattered. Their actions had answered it long before the trip existed. They had built a celebration that functioned best without me. And realizing that truth marked a shift I couldn't reverse, even if I tried. As the season edged closer to December, the distance between my family and me began to take on a different shape. It wasn't just the unspoken plans or the intentional silence. It was the way my existence started being rewritten in spaces I couldn't control. The shift didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through the notifications on my phone, each one revealing a version of me that didn't resemble the person living my life. The first sign was a vague post from my mom, Brenda. She wrote about gratitude, sacrifice, and the burden of loving children who forget the hands that lifted them. She never used my name, but she didn't need to. Anyone who knew us could read between the lines. The comments came quickly, filled with sympathy for her, and suggestions about how children nowadays lack respect. There was a warmth in the responses she received, a validation that strengthened her narrative. Watching it unfold gave me an unpleasant reminder. Perception, not truth, was the currency she relied on. More posts followed, each wrapped in the same polished tone she used when she wanted admiration. She framed herself as a parent carrying impossible weight, all while hinting at a daughter who failed to care. The pattern became clear. She wasn't seeking comfort. She was constructing a story in which she was the victim. It was a role she played well, gentle, wounded, endlessly giving, and people embraced it because it was easier than questioning her sincerity. My dad Howard added quiet approval through likes and subtle gestures of agreement. He rarely expressed opinions publicly, but his silence always worked in her favor. My older brother Derek posted something cryptic about family loyalty, which was enough to reinforce the portrait they were painting together. Their version of events began spreading through our community in ways I couldn't stop, shaping how others viewed me before I even understood what was happening. I felt a strange detachment watching their story take hold. It wasn't anger. It was more like observing a storm forming offshore, knowing it was headed directly toward me but unable to stop its momentum. I saw acquaintances sharing her posts, neighbors offering comfort, members of the church group praising her strength. They echoed her words without realizing the harm they carried. The narrative they accepted so quickly became another reminder of how invisible I had been in my own family. Around this time, I reached out to my friend Nina, one of the few people who had seen enough of my life to recognize the imbalance I carried. She listened without judgment as I explained the pattern forming online. Even though I spoke cautiously, she understood the truth beneath every hesitation. Her presence grounded me, not through advice, but through the quiet acknowledgement that what I was experiencing wasn't imagined. I didn't need more than that. Validation from someone outside the structure of my family felt like reclaiming a part of myself. After that conversation, I felt a pull towards something I had avoided for years: the evidence buried in old messages, receipts, and transactions. I began gathering everything I could find, not because I intended to use it then, but because I needed a place where the truth existed untouched. I opened folders on my laptop, labeled them with dates, and filled them with screenshots showing how often I had covered expenses under the banner of support. Each image captured a moment they pretended never happened. Each file restored a piece of the story they were trying to erase. I revisited bank statements that revealed patterns I once dismissed as coincidence. The transfers I made to bridge gaps in their bills weren't occasional acts of care. They formed a steady stream that aligned too perfectly with their choices. I sifted through years of digital traces, requests framed as emergencies, gratitude that faded quickly, and promises of repayment that dissolved into silence. The evidence didn't shock me. What surprised me was how easily I had accepted it all as normal. There were voice messages filled with urgency that now sounded rehearsed. There were notes in my phone tracking due dates that weren't mine. There were emails confirming payments I had forgotten about because keeping up had become routine. Piece by piece, I assembled a record of how distorted our dynamic had become. It felt like observing a map of a place I had lived my entire life, but never seen from above. As the folder grew, something within me settled. The truth wasn't chaotic. It wasn't emotional. It was orderly, factual, and undeniable. For the first time, I wasn't trying to justify anything. I wasn't searching for excuses or questioning my memory. I was simply acknowledging the pattern my family relied on, and the role I had played without realizing the cost. The more I collected, the clearer everything became. Their narrative online wasn't rooted in misunderstanding. It was a strategy. They had a version of the story they wanted the world to believe, and I wasn't part of it unless I played the role they assigned to me. That realization didn't spark confrontation. Instead, it sparked a quiet resolve, a shift in my thinking that marked the beginning of something I couldn't yet define, but could no longer ignore. As December settled in, a heaviness pressed against my thoughts in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The quiet distance that had been forming for months suddenly sharpened into something unmistakable, as though the final thread holding everything together had finally snapped. It happened in the form of a voicemail, short, controlled, and delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed their tone long before speaking. Hearing my mom Brenda declare that Christmas was no longer happening felt strangely hollow. The words carried no warmth, no hesitation, just a blunt finality that landed with the weight of an ending I hadn't realized was already in motion. Her message didn't ask anything of me. It didn't leave room for interpretation. It simply announced a decision, as though canceling the holiday, and my place in it, was as casual as removing an item from a list. I listened to it once, then again, waiting for something inside me to react. But nothing rose. No shock. No sadness. only the steady awareness that whatever remained between us had eroded past the point of repair. The absence of emotion didn't scare me. It clarified things. Her voice wasn't a loss. It was confirmation. Responding with a single word felt natural. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to question. I had already spent years carrying more than my share, cushioning their choices with my stability. That message made it clear they didn't see the imbalance, and more importantly, didn't intend to. For the first time, I felt an unusual calm settle in me, a stillness that didn't come from acceptance, but from recognition. That calm followed me as I opened my laptop. Logging into the mortgage account didn't feel impulsive or dramatic. It felt necessary. Seeing my name beside theirs reminded me of every moment I had overlooked my own boundaries for the sake of maintaining theirs. Each section of the form I filled out carried a quiet weight, marking the removal of ties I once believed were unbreakable. I read every warning, every note about potential consequences, not to reconsider, but to understand the full extent of what I was choosing to undo. Submitting the request brought a clarity I hadn't expected. The confirmation on the screen was stark and unemotional, yet it felt like the first honest moment I'd had with myself in years. There was no going back after that. But the truth was simple. I no longer wanted to. 2 days later, the reaction arrived with force. My phone turned into a pulsing reminder of their unraveling. Dozens of missed calls stacked one after another, notifications blending into a constant vibration that filled the apartment with a faint, restless buzzing. Each call seemed more frantic than the last. Voicemails multiplied quickly, their lengths growing as desperation rose. Messages poured in at every hour, creating a flood of urgency I no longer felt responsible for absorbing. It was strange, watching chaos bloom in places where my absence had once gone unnoticed. Their panic carried a familiarity, not because I recognized their emotions, but because I recognized the expectation behind them. They believed I would step in. They believed I would fix things. They believed the weight I had carried for so long was still chained to me, ready for them to pull whenever their world grew unstable. The shift came when an unfamiliar number appeared in the list of missed calls. The voicemail attached to it carried a measured tone, smooth and practiced, belonging to someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. He introduced himself as their attorney, emphasizing a desire to resolve misunderstandings and urging me to reach out as soon as possible. The phrasing was careful, but the intention wasn't. His message revealed more than he intended, namely that they had already leaned on legal intimidation before attempting a single honest conversation. Hearing that confirmed what I needed to know. Their urgency wasn't rooted in concern for me. It was rooted in fear of losing the support they had come to rely on. The panic wasn't about the disintegration of a relationship. It was about the collapse of a safety net they had assumed would never fray. Oddly, the realization didn't wound me. It steadied me. I deleted nothing. I listened to every voicemail, not out of curiosity, but out of acknowledgement. Each message carried a version of them I had known for years, dependence masked as authority, guilt wrapped in entitlement, pressure disguised as urgency. It was a pattern that had shaped my entire adult life, so ingrained it had once felt natural. But something had shifted in me the moment I removed my name from that mortgage. Their expectations no longer dictated my actions. Their panic no longer determined my choices. And their attempts to regain control no longer carried power over me. As the calls continued, I understood something quietly transformative. This was the first time they were experiencing the consequences of decisions they once believed I would always cushion. And for the first time, I wasn't stepping in to soften the impact. As evening settled over the week's tension, the momentum of everything pushed me toward a single decision I had avoided for far too long. The constant calls, the attorney's carefully crafted messages, the frantic attempts to regain control, all of it formed a pressure that no longer intimidated me, but clarified what needed to happen. I chose a location that held no emotional weight for any of us, a small diner on the edge of town where anonymity felt natural. It wasn't a place for warmth or nostalgia, it was neutral ground, a setting stripped of history, and that was precisely why I selected it. Sitting in a booth by the window, I noticed how calm my breathing felt, how steady my thoughts were. There was no anticipation of reconciliation, no desire to repair anything, only a quiet readiness to confront the truth without flinching. For years, every gathering with my family had carried an invisible script I had been expected to follow. This time, there was no script, no role to slip back into. I wasn't arriving as their helper, their buffer, or their excuse. I was arriving as someone who had finally stopped allowing herself to be rewritten. When the door opened and the familiar trio stepped inside, I recognized the shift in their expressions instantly. They carried unease like a shadow, anxiety layered beneath irritation, entitlement layered beneath fear. My mom Brenda scanned the room quickly, searching for an emotional foothold she could use. My dad Howard's posture held an edge of frustration he couldn't disguise. My brother Derek walked slightly behind them, wearing the strained composure of someone who expected a confrontation, yet still believed he held an upper hand. Watching them approach felt oddly distant, as though I were observing a scene instead of participating in it. Their collective tension didn't stir anything in me beyond acknowledgement. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to interpret their moods or adjust myself to accommodate them. I was simply witnessing the weight of consequences they had never believed would reach them. As they settled into the booth across from me, I felt a quiet certainty take shape. Everything they projected, frustration, defensiveness, forced concern, stemmed from the same truth. They were afraid of losing the support they had mistaken for obligation. Their expressions shifted subtly as they realized I wasn't responding with guilt, panic, or apology. That absence of reaction disarmed them more effectively than any argument could have. Sitting across from them, I could feel years of imbalance stretching behind us like a long, unbroken road. Each memory surfaced with sharp clarity, the countless moments when my needs had been minimized, when my boundaries had been treated as inconveniences, when their comfort had been placed above my well-being. What surprised me wasn't the recollection of these instances, but how little emotion they stirred now. It felt like reviewing the history of someone I no longer recognized. As I organized my thoughts, I felt no urge to justify myself or soften anything. The facts were enough, and presenting them didn't require dramatics or anger. The weight of proof I had gathered existed independent of emotion. Years of transfers, requests, obligations, and unspoken expectations formed a structure that couldn't be denied. The imbalance wasn't theoretical. It was documented, preserved in records they had assumed I would never scrutinize. The calm within me deepened as I placed the evidence on the table. There was no satisfaction in the act, only a sense of completion. Their reactions shifted quickly, confusion tightening into fear, fear mixing with disbelief, disbelief turning into a desperate attempt to hold on to authority that was already slipping through their grasp. Observing their unraveling felt surreal, not because they were surprised, but because they had always believed they were untouchable. Before the weight of the moment settled fully, the door opened again. This time, the presence that entered carried an authority none of them could dismiss. My grandfather, Thomas Lane, walked in with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that silence often commanded more attention than raised voices. He wasn't part of the patterns that shaped my relationship with the rest of the family, yet he had watched from a distance long enough to understand more than they realized. His arrival shifted the atmosphere instantly, not through confrontation, but through the clarity he carried with him. Seeing him approach the table created a stillness that cut through every defensive facade in the room. His expression held none of the softness my family relied on to manipulate sympathy. What he carried instead was discernment, a recognition sharpened by years of observing patterns they believed were hidden. When he reached our booth, the realization settled over all three of them simultaneously. The narrative they had constructed was collapsing under the weight of someone who refused to entertain illusions. His presence didn't rescue me. It validated what I already knew. Truth doesn't need permission to stand. And in that moment, as he took the empty seat beside me, I understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever remained of their hold on my life had ended long before this meeting ever began. In the days that followed the diner meeting, a noticeable quiet settled over everything, not because tension had faded, but because truth had rearranged the landscape in ways none of them could reverse. The moment my grandfather Thomas Lane took his place beside me, the foundation they had relied on began to fracture. And in the silence that now stretched between us, I began to grasp the full weight of what reclaiming my life actually meant. Returning home afterward, I felt an unusual steadiness, an internal alignment that didn't require validation. The patterns that once shaped my interactions with them no longer held influence. Their expectations, their narratives, their attempts to control the story had collapsed under the simple force of reality. It wasn't triumph I felt, and it wasn't revenge. It was clarity. And with that clarity came a freedom I had never experienced within my family. Their unraveling grew visible almost immediately. I received updates from sources I hadn't expected: neighbors, extended relatives, acquaintances who had once echoed my mother Brenda's online claims without hesitation. Their messages were filled with confusion, shock, and a sudden shift in tone. Screenshots of deleted posts surfaced, along with statements filled with regret for having believed a narrative that no longer held structure. I didn't respond to any of them. Their realization belonged to them, not to me. The consequences for my parents unfolded faster than I anticipated. The mortgage reassessment moved forward without obstruction. Their financial instability, once concealed beneath the support I provided, stood exposed. Notices arrived at their home, demanding proof of income and updated documentation they could not supply. The unraveling of their security felt abrupt from the outside. But for me, it reflected years of imbalance finally surfacing. My brother Derek experienced his own reckoning. Without the shield of family advantage, the confidence he once exhibited slipped away. A relative informed me quietly that he had been rejected from a loan application he expected to receive easily. The patterns of entitlement that shaped him had left him unprepared for independence. I didn't feel satisfaction at this news, only recognition. He had spent so long relying on the structure my parents created that he never learned to build one himself. As the consequences deepened, the silence from my family grew heavier. They no longer sent calls or messages. They no longer tried to force explanations or apologies. Their absence wasn't an attempt at respect. It was resignation. The reality they faced was one where I no longer held their burdens, and they no longer possessed the ability to shift responsibility onto me. That separation created a distance they didn't know how to navigate. During this period, my grandfather visited again. He didn't arrive with advice or warnings. He brought a simple calm that helped settle the fragments inside me. Sitting across from him at my small kitchen table, I realized how different his presence felt from the chaos I had grown accustomed to. He didn't try to shape my choices. He didn't try to soften the truth. He simply acknowledged the strength it took to step away from a dynamic that had taken root long before I ever understood it. After he left, I spent several evenings reflecting on what had happened, not the events themselves, but the years leading to them. I examined the patterns I once accepted as normal, the sacrifices I mistook for love, and the imbalance I endured in the hope of maintaining connection. It was an uncomfortable reflection, but a necessary one. Understanding where things fractured meant understanding where healing could begin. The final step came quietly, without ceremony. I removed my family from every part of my daily life: contact lists, social media, shared accounts, emergency information. As each link disappeared, I felt a subtle release, like loosening knots I had carried for too long. None of it felt harsh. It felt appropriate. It felt honest. Cutting ties didn't erase the past, and it didn't erase the pain, but it created space for something I had never given myself permission to imagine: a life defined by my own terms. I no longer needed to bend myself around expectations that diminished me. I no longer needed to carry guilt for protecting my well-being. What remained was a quiet confidence that choosing myself wasn't abandonment, it was survival. And standing inside that clarity, I understood the lesson this entire experience carved into my life. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the same people who rely on your silence to continue benefiting from your pain. Sometimes the most radical act of self-respect is simply refusing to participate in your own exploitation. And sometimes, the only way to break a generational pattern is to walk away from it completely. My story isn't about revenge. It isn't about punishment. It's about finally seeing the truth behind the roles we're assigned and finding the courage to step out of a narrative that was never written for our well-being. If there is anything I hope someone can take from this, it's this: you do not owe your life to people who only value the parts of you they can use. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep a family warm. And you are allowed, fully allowed, to walk away from those who refuse to see you as anything more than a resource. For the first time, I chose myself, and it saved my life.